All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Michael Mays, author and researcher. Welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I am glad to have you, man. I was telling you just before we went on that I was had a great conversation with Daryl Collier the other day, and he was telling me that I should have you on the show because you would be a perfect guest. And I was able to tell Daryl, for once in my life, I was ahead of the game and already had you scheduled. So I'm really glad to have you here. Let's get into this Bigfoot thing. Let's talk about what's on everybody's mind. Usually, when we talk to people on the show, whether you're an author, experiencer, researcher, everybody wants to know what got you interested, or at least I want to know what got you interested in the subject to begin with.
In my case, I think my story is probably not that different than that of many people in their 50s, which I am. I grew up in the golden age, a child of the 70s, my childhood. And it's a golden age for Bigfoot programs. Leonard Nimoy's In Search Of was on. Peter Graves' show was on. There was Sid and Marty Krofft. You remember those guys on Saturday mornings? They had a show. It was called Bigfoot and Wild Boy, and that was on. And then I think one of the bigger events of my life was when Bigfoot made an appearance on the $6 Million Man when I was a kid. So that was a big deal. But the hook was set pretty good once I was a little older and was allowed to see Boggy Creek. That kind of set the hook for me, and I've been interested ever since.
It's so funny. I've done this show for a couple of years now. I had Lyle Blackburn on. I guess it was a year or so back, and I admitted on the show then, and I've done it even since then, I still have not ever watched the Legend of Boggy Creek movie. I'm probably one of the few people that is interested in Bigfoot in any way, shape, form, or fashion who hasn't seen that movie. But when it comes up on the show, I always make a mental note, and sometimes I literally write it down and say, I need to watch the Legend of Boggy Creek. So I know there's a new, or at least I think there's a new version out that may be like Ultra 4K or something. They've enhanced it. So I'm going to have to look that up and take a look at it. But I can certainly relate to you as far as the $6 Million Man. I'm a little younger than you. I'm late 40s. So I was more of a child of the 80s, but I remember seeing those iconic images of the $6 Million Man, Lou Ferrigno, obviously from the Hulk. I was a big fan of the Hulk growing up. I love the fact that even back then, there was something in the zeitgeist that was moving through, and they were able to incorporate Bigfoot, Sasquatch into the homes of millions of people, really. And I know it was more of a joke back then than it may be today. There's a little bit of it permeates through the community, I think. But for the most part, I think that sort of, like you said, set the hook for a lot of people in this generation that are really taking a hardcore look at that. I guess the next question that kind of set the hook for you. When did you really start getting into looking into the subject in a serious way from a research standpoint?
Oh, I was probably, I guess, my late 30s. I had grown up, gone to school, got a job, got married, had a couple kids, and was just doing the adult thing. And I belonged to an outdoors group. It's called Legacy Outfitters. And once a month we would meet. And there was always a speaker who came in we'd have a meal and then listen to a speaker talk about some specific outdoors related topic. It could be anything from training retrievers to archery to just, it could be anything. How to work a crankbait. And this particular night, Daryl Collier, as a matter of fact, is who came to speak to us about the subject of Bigfoot. And it rekindled all that interest I'd had as a kid. And I talked to Daryl for a good while after that program, and this guy doesn't sound crazy. And I grew up in East Texas, so stories of wild men and swamp monsters and the like, they permeated the culture back then. And I'm sure it was more popular among young folks than it was older folks. But I grew up in big thicket country, and that's the wild man's a big deal down there. And I guess I had just never put two and two together to realize that this creature that was supposed to be roaming around in the Pacific Northwest might be somehow related to what people in the piney woods of East Texas reported from time to time. And that kind of a little bell went off, and that interest was rekindled. And so it was at that point, a friend of who was also at that presentation, he and I started to go out. I had done enough looking around on the internet, which was still, I won't say infancy, but there wasn't the sheer volume of stuff out there that there is now. But I had looked around enough to know there was a lot of silliness out there when it came to the topic, and we might be better off just trying to do this ourselves. And so that's when it started again in my late 30s.
I know you eventually became involved in the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. Daryl and I talked about that at length. I've had Matt Pruitt. Matt's a friend of mine and a friend of the show. Matt and I have talked about it on the show before. Once you had those conversations and you guys started going out, when did you get involved in the North American Wood Ape Conservancy? And if you wouldn't mind, just give everybody sort of a brief overview of what that organization was and is today.
Okay, the origin story of the organization, it started out, it was known as the Texas Bigfoot Research Center originally. It was started by a couple of guys, including Craig Woolheater, who people who are interested in this topic probably have at least heard Craig's name before. It morphed from center to conservancy. The word center alluded to an actual physical location somewhere, which we didn't have. And conservancy is really more what we were about. We wanted to prove these animals were real and then try to conserve the animal and the habitat. And then later, we decided to take a next step. We did the necessary paperwork to become a 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit or profit organization. And when we did, we changed the name. We wanted to be less regional, take reports from all over. We wanted membership, not just from Texas, for example, but from all over. And we also felt the name Bigfoot kind of became synonymous with it's all a big joke. It's a ha thing. It's Jack's Links and it's Saturday cartoons and so on. And so we rebranded the organization as the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, and that's where we've been ever since. Now, how I got involved with them, as I was telling you before, a friend and I from work, we had started to go out on our own and look for these things. We raided the databases of both the big BFRO and the TBRC at that time. And we started to look for places in East Texas that weren't too terribly far from where we were. And all we did was we looked for counties that had the most sightings reported, and in every report, part of the documentation, they ask, what's the nearest town to where the visual took place? They didn't provide exact coordinates or anything, but they did provide that. And so we just did a little digging there, and we found the spot that had the most reports, closest to this little town in East Texas. We got reports all around it. And it was an area I was familiar with, having grown up down there. And so we started making trips down there. And it was not on our first trip. I couldn't tell you how many trips it was, but we had gone down. It was in May of 2005. In Texas, the comfortable camping season is alarmingly short. You're either freezing or you're in a microwave. There's very little in between. So May is a good time to be out. And we were going to have a big moon that night. And so we had set up camp, and then we decided to just rest until about midnight. And we got up and we started driving the Forest Service roads. Just one of the big categories of visuals is motorists, right? Road crossings and things like that. Visibility was good because the moon was big and bright. And we had been driving about 3 hours, if I recall. It was about 3:15 a.m. And we were in the middle of nowhere on a Forest Service road, and we came over a little rise, and I had wasted $100 on a Gen 1 night vision monocular from Academy, and just was struggling with admitting that this thing was really a piece of garbage. And I was really trying to tell myself I hadn't wasted my money, and I was trying to use it and get some use out of it. And I was actually looking out the front passenger window out into the wood line. And my buddy was driving, and we came over this small rise, and he just brought the vehicle to a very quick, sudden stop. It rocked forward. And I just turned all the way across to look at him. I'm like, what? And he was pointing. And he was just pointing like that. And he said, what is that? And about 40 yards in front of the vehicle, something standing in the road on two legs. And we were on a rise, and so we were in his small car. It's not exactly what you pictured the mighty Bigfoot hunter driving. He drove a Mazda Protege at the time, if you remember those. We alternated who drove every trip. I had a truck, but he didn't, so it was his turn. But it was low to the ground. It was very quiet. And I've wondered since then if that's not why we weren't able to get up on it, because it was so quiet. But we were on this hill, so we're slightly tilted downwards. So this thing's bottom half was illuminated pretty well. The top half was more in shadow, like a silhouette, but we could see that it was a reddish brown color, clearly standing up on two legs. And it was very brief. It was about 1,001, 1,002. It took a side step as it's facing us with its right foot. It stepped to the side, what would be its right leg and foot, brought its left foot across its body. And at that point, it also brought its left across. And we clearly saw the arm and hand as it crossed in front, and took one more step, stepped over a bar ditch, and was gone into the woods. And so it was brief, really anticlimactic and unspectacular, except for what the animal was. It was an animal on the road. And we quickly drove up to the spot. I've been asked a lot of times, did you get out and chase it? Oh, I didn't. We did not. And we did drive the rest of the night up and down that road. Obviously, we were hoping to see it again. We drove that and many surrounding Forest Service roads. We really didn't think we would see it again, but we were hoping we would. But what we were really doing was looking to see if there was any sign of anyone else in the area. Anybody camping? Are there any vehicles parked? Is there a horse tied up somewhere? Anything. And we drove the rest of the night till slightly past sunup. We didn't see another vehicle. That was about 3:15 when we had the visual. We didn't see another vehicle till about 6:15, 6:30. And by then the sun was coming up. And so we pondered on what could that have been. And in my mind, there's really only two logical answers. It's a guy in a monkey suit playing a trick, or it's the real thing. And in the years since, I've gone back, we've done a reenactment of it. I initially reported it as being man-sized, and that's what prompted me to make a report and ended up joining the organization. So that's how I got into the TBRC, to answer the original question. But it was after that, it was Daryl and we had gone back to the site, and we're going to try to reenact it. He says, we're going to park here. I'm going to walk out in front of the vehicle. You tell me to stop when I'm about how far it was. And so I did. And it was only then that I realized that this thing was a lot bigger than I had initially thought it was. Daryl's about 5'11". He'll tell you he's 6 foot, but he's not. But he's about 5'11". This thing was a full head above him. And what was more impressive, though, is if he had been standing there, if this animal had been standing behind him, you would have seen it on both sides of him. It was so much wider. That's what was the most impressive thing to me. So a full head taller, it's approaching 7 feet tall, if not 7 feet tall, and considerably thicker and wider. And that's when the idea of a hoaxer kind of left my mind at that point too. A monkey suit's hard enough to find, but one that fits a 7 foot tall guy is probably even more rare. And then the last kind of piece of that puzzle is, this is Texas. Everybody's got a gun in their truck. You're playing with your life if you do that out in the middle of the woods. And it just seemed to make more sense that this was just really what we had come to try to find.
You said the bottom half of this thing was pretty well illuminated. I don't know if you got a chance to see the face, but are there any details that stood out to you as far as the hair, the build, that you can share as far as more detail about what you saw?
Not really. Like I said, it was very brief. And there's that moment of, what am I looking at? And like it was the color, it was a reddish brown, not like bright orangutan orange, reddish brown. It was the color of long dead pine needles, if that makes sense. Not fresh ones that are still pretty bright, but ones that have been dead a long time, that dull reddish brown color. The hair, it was clearly hair covered. I couldn't tell you, was it 6 inches long? Was it 4 inches long? I couldn't tell you. And the upper half was, like I said, it was silhouette. It was just a shadow, basically. I couldn't tell you much detail at all. Other than that, we did see the arm cross as it pivoted there in the road. And that left arm was really long. I do remember how as it swung by, it was pretty low on the leg. Now, was it all the way to knee level? I'm not sure I could tell you that, but it struck me, the length of it. But that's about all I could tell you about it. More impressive is it was about halfway in the middle. It was about in the middle of the road. And in 3 steps, it crossed, not only that half of the road, but stepped over a bar ditch and was gone. And we could jump the bar ditch. We went back the next morning, but it required a little bit of a slightly jog and run and start in order to do it. And this thing just strode across it like it was nothing.
I love the question that people always ask, did you run after it? Because I've never seen one of these things, but I've heard what I believe to be one, maybe 30, 40 yards from the house at 10 o'clock at night with the windows open. And that's the first thing people ask me, did you run out and see what it was? No, I didn't.
Yeah.
I'm not going to chase after this thing in the woods and not know what I'm chasing after. Number one, if it was a Sasquatch, it might have torn me apart. If it was some other wild animal besides a Sasquatch that I was hearing making this vocalization, I don't want any part of it either way.
Yeah, it's when, and you're stunned what you've seen. There's the Monday morning quarterbacks are always accurate. They always make the right call. And I'm not, it's a legitimate question. Did you follow it? Did you know? And I was brand new to this. I had no idea anything about them. What might it do if we did? Is it more likely to be half a mile away already or to be just behind that tree waiting on me to come out? I had no idea. And so we didn't. Now, we did come back the next morning to look for any kind of evidence, a print or something, but we couldn't find anything. But no, we didn't get out and chase it. We didn't notice any kind of smell. It made no sounds that we could discern. We did hear it. Our windows were down. You could hear it crunch as it stepped on leaf litter and forest debris. At least seemed like I only heard it a couple times and it was gone. So maybe it just squatted down or maybe it just got out of earshot. I don't know. But that's it. Like I said, it's really unspectacular except for what it was.
Yeah, definitely what it was is the most spectacular part of that. But here's the thing that has always bugged me, Michael. And I have taken a lot of reports. The very first episode of this show ever was a roadside crossing I documented here in North Carolina, where I'm at. And it's always stuck in my craw that we're talking about one of the most elusive creatures, if you believe any of this at all, and believe they exist. If you believe any of this at all, we're talking about one of the most elusive creatures on Earth, in my opinion. And yet, I hear stories like yours. You guys were in a very secluded area and you're driving around on these roads looking for these things. But the one that I documented was a regular road. This guy was driving to work and this thing steps out in front of him. And that's a very common sighting. Now that you've been in this for a while, do you have an opinion? And obviously it's speculation because nobody really knows. But what is your opinion on these very elusive creatures stepping out into the middle of the road where people like you and other people that I've documented come across them and see them?
Like you said, it's pure speculation. But one thing that I believe that we have learned about them through the years as we've pursued these things is we don't think they're very good at multitasking. We have had situations up in Area X, our study area, where some kind of something's going on. There's somebody working on a cabin or something. They're swinging a hammer and banging around and there's saws going and things like that. And then somebody hiking in from the opposite direction catches one of these things as it's watching what's going on with the other thing. We've had some success with a little trickery at night when we believe one is up, say, for example, up on the hillside observing camp. We'll have, say, 4 people. We'll stand up. We'll turn on 3 flashlights or 3 headlamps, and we'll walk 100 yards to the general vicinity where we think this thing is just up the hill. And then we'll stand there and talk and visit for a minute. And then we will leave that 4th unlit member in place there as the other 3 walk back. And so you've got 3 lights went out, 3 lights came back, and sometimes that has led to an encounter of some kind, that sort of of things, counting and multitasking. If this thing had its eyes on a deer or something across the road and it felt like it was time to make its move, it may never even have heard or noticed the car if it had that laser focus. The multitasking thing seems to be a weak point for them. But beyond that, we believe they're animals. Why does a deer dart in front of you at the last second? Why doesn't it just wait for you to get by? And certainly these things are more intelligent as primates, which is what they would have to be. So I don't know for sure, but those are just some thoughts that we've discussed over the years.
I got you. And after you had this experience, was that the only experience you had with these things before you got into Area X, or did you continue with the bug and continue to go out? And did you have other experiences before that?
Yeah, there were a few. We spent a lot of time in Southeast Texas. We had three main study areas at the time. One was in East Texas. I wouldn't call it Southeast Texas. It was more Central East Texas. And then there was deep Southeast Texas in the Big Thicket, one of the units there. And then there was this area we now call Area X. And we called them areas X, Y, and Z. And they just as easily could have been A, B, and C, but we called them X, Y, and Z. And working in the Big Thicket, we had several interesting things happen over the years. But we had to work with the National Park Service, and we had to get scientific research permits, and we were subject to their regulations and their whim as to whether they would let us in there or not. And for a while they did, and we had a camera trapping project. We had cameras in there. We were doing a wildlife survey for them basically for free. We were, of course, hoping to get, photos of the target species. But so through those experiences there, we had some odd things occur over the years, but eventually park superintendents changed. The new person coming in was not very amenable to what we were trying to do, and he denied our request to go back in there. Area Y was out. Area Z turned out to be a bust. We think the landowner was manufacturing evidence, and we think it was just a big hoax. But Area X has stood the test of time, and that's how it got its name. It's a real cool, creepy X-Files kind of name, but it really, that's how it got its name. I wish I could tell you it was something cooler than that, but it was just the one that was left. And we still investigate reports, and we'll go out on site, but our main area of interest is still in that location.
Let's talk a little bit about, I know one of the things that Daryl and I talked about recently was all the man hours that you guys put in. And that's one of the things I love about your group, the Conservancy, is that there is as much time in the woods as possible to document as much as you possibly can. There's constantly boots on the ground there for the most part. And once you got into this area, what was some of the first experiences that you started having when you hit Area X?
Oh, the first night I was there, having grown up in East Texas, I had been working mostly Area Y, the Big Thicket area. I was familiar with it, knew my way around, and it was several years into our presence there in Area X, which is in Oklahoma. I don't think that's a big secret. Everybody knows that. And so several years had gone by, and I had not been yet because I was working the Southeast Texas site. But once we got booted out of there, I started to go. And my first night there, I was staying in, there were a couple of primitive cabins on site, and something is just screaming its head off out in the woods to the south of us. And I've heard rabbits screaming. I've heard foxes and the weird noises they can make. And I've tried to educate myself even as far as what mountain lions and coyotes can make some weird sounds too. But this was the classic, sounds like a lunatic out there just screaming their head off. And I remember saying to Daryl, he was there, I was like, what the hell kind of place have you brought me to here? What is this? And it's just this amazing place. It's a wilderness. And I think most people don't realize there are places like that in the heart of the country still. And so that was my introduction that very first night. But I've been in cabins that have just been smashed by rocks. I've been in cabins where it sounded like a big meaty kind of slap, like something just hauled off and whacked the side of the cabin. I've been in the cabin when something hit it so hard that dust rained down out of the rafters and shotguns that were leaned up against the wall got knocked over. caught flashes of movement, been there when other people had visuals, heard classic Bigfoot related sounds. I think everybody who's into this is probably familiar with the Ohio howl that was recorded all those years ago. Have heard that there. Not the exact thing as if somebody was playing a recording, but cries and howls like that. We've heard screams. We've heard anomalous whistling. We've just all kinds of weird stuff. And in the early years, it was almost more than you could keep up with. It really was. And it's hard to believe. It's hard for people to believe it, but it really was an incredible place, and it very scary at times. And then other times you're just scratching your head like, what in the world is, and as far as, no, the best, the most intense encounter I've had there was not even a visual. It's an auditory encounter. And this was in 2019. I don't know if you're interested in hearing about that, but where we are now is in a slightly different location than we were originally. We're still in the same general area, very close, but we've got a little hunter's cabin that we built there. We have a metal structure. It's basically a carport type structure. Just, it rains a lot there, and just to keep equipment under to keep it dry. And it's open on 3 sides, but on the side that's closest to the mountain slope where our cabin is set, there's a metal wall that comes all the way down to the ground. Why it's on one side and not, I don't know. I guess it's so you can put shelves or something on that side. But anyway, I was out one night. We were doing what we call overwatch. We learned that you can take a thermal scope or thermal monocular, and you can see through black plastic with that thermal. And so we had started years before. We had made structures. I don't know if Daryl went into this with you or not, but overwatch tents, we called them, in structures. And we had built some panels on the porch of this hunter's cabin that were black plastic. So you can't see if somebody's sitting there or not, but you can see out. But it was a pretty hot night. We wanted to be out where the air was circulating a little bit. And it was me and one other researcher named Tony Schmidt, also a board member these days. And we were sitting around a cold fire ring. We always run a cold camp. We feel like they're interested in us. The less ambient light we give them, the closer they have to get to take a good look at us. That's the theory. And in this case, it seemed to pan out. And so from just behind the metal structure, we call it the Hooch, suddenly, just out of nowhere, something is just beating the ground with a stick or a club or something. And it just, bam, over and over. This goes on for a minute. We just hold our spot, and we've got, like I said, the thermals, and we're looking in that direction, but that wall that comes down to the ground, we think it's behind that wall. We can't see it. And we're like, okay, let's just sit tight, and maybe it will come a little closer. Maybe it'll step out and we'll be able to get a look at this, whatever it is. Now, a few minutes go by, and then the next thing, you hear it again. And, bam, it's even faster. The perception was, it was mad, whatever it was. Now, that's me projecting on it, but it would just sounded like something angry. And it was whatever it was swinging was so hard, you could hear it whistling through the air right before it hit the ground. If you've ever watched a golf tournament, right before the ball is struck by the club, you hear the contact. And so, bam, like that, just over and over. And it sounded like it was right under that structure, which was only 10 to 15 yards from where we're sitting. And we've got the thermals, and we cannot see it. And I said, Tony, this thing's broken. That thing is right there, right? So hit the headlamp with the white light, and immediately the noise stops, and there's nothing there. And so now we're really perplexed. At this point, we're more confused than we are afraid or anything. So we said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to move up onto the porch. Wherever this is doesn't want us out here. So we're going to go up onto the porch behind the panels. We're going to make a big production out of shuffling around for a minute. We're going to open the door. closed the door as if we'd gone inside to go to sleep, and we sat on the porch instead. And it was just a few seconds after we had sat down that we hear it again, and it's even louder and it's even faster. Well, bam, just over and over again. It sounds like I'm sitting on this edge of the porch closest to the mountain slope, and it sounds close enough like it's going to snatch me right off that porch. That's how close it sounds. And then the last impact sound we heard, it was hitting the ground. And then I don't know if it threw something, if whatever it had been hitting the ground with, it struck the side of the Hooch, that carport structure. But it hit that thing so hard that it just reverberated for 3 solid minutes after. You could hear it humming, like it rung the structure like a bell. It was unbelievable. When it did that, we jumped off the porch, hit the lights, looked, and we saw nothing. The conclusions from that are few and far between. You have to think whatever was doing, a bear can't do that. Something with hands is swinging a club, a limb, something, and beating the ground. A bear can't do that. And there's nothing else in those mountains native to that area that would be able to. It obviously was not as close as we thought it was, which is even more uncomfortable in a way because the strength, the power is what I struggle to get across to people. The power that this thing had as it hit the ground, it was staggering. And then the noise it made when it either threw or struck that metal wall was just tinnitus for 2 days after. That's how loud it was, ringing in your ears. It was very intense. And I just don't know what else that possibly could have been.
Yeah, some of the most intense encounters I think I've ever documented were when nobody saw a thing. It was more the auditory thing, whether it be like that, like some sort of intimidation display, possibly with them beating on something, or the vocalizations that people hear. So I definitely think there's something to that. And I love every bit of data. To me, is important. A lot of people don't even want to come on the show and say, I just heard this, or I just felt that, or I just found this. I didn't actually see this thing. But I think all of that is obviously data. One of the things that really fascinated me about Area X and what you guys were doing, I had Kathy Strain on a couple of years ago, and Kathy shared a lot of her encounters. She had seen some what looked to be juveniles or possibly babies. Yeah. And I always wondered if there's so much activity from you guys, it's more of a, you're coming and going, there's people there for months at a time. Why are these things not leaving? And it just all came together for me recently in a conversation again with Daryl. He said he believes that he called this a core area for these things. Is that sort of the consensus that you guys have come to, is that this is some sort of an area that these things are doing certain things in, and that's why they're sticking around and you're having all this experience?
Yeah, it's, again, you're talking about indulging speculation, but it's all we have right now. But this particular troop or group has not left despite our presence. And yeah, I don't want to make people think we're there more often than we are. We're there for pretty much 3 months straight, summer. But the winter months, we're really not there much at all. 3/4 of the year, there's very little human traffic down there at all. It's very hard to get to. This group does not seem to leave. Is that because they're pinned in by development? They can't leave? There's certainly room for them to move to some degree, but they do tend to stay there. And so it's been speculated, is this kind of the nursery? Is this where mom and the babies live while the males are out on the perimeter foraging and doing whatever they do? And we've stumbled onto this area where we're in their living room. And some of the behaviors that we've been witness to and documented they're just classic, straight out of the great ape intimidation behavior kind of stuff, shaking of branches, throwing rocks and branches, roars and growls and all that kind of stuff. That's straight out of the great ape handbook. And they want you gone. And if you think about it, that would work on 99% of people. We think they're hardwired. They had this bag of tricks. They throw rocks, they growl, they shake vegetation, they do all that stuff. If that doesn't work, they might allow themselves to be briefly seen. And we've got bluff charges documented, for example, and things like that. But once they exhaust that bag of tricks, that kind of seems to be all they got. That's all they have. They haven't gone beyond that. And I'm not saying they couldn't or wouldn't, but this particular group that we seem to be running into on occasion, that's their thing. And if that doesn't work, that they keep doing it, but they don't have a plan B, it doesn't seem. And I think it's likely it comes from hundreds, if not thousands of years of living in close contact with humans. All that stuff works almost every single time. You think you're out camping and all of a sudden something's screaming its head off and throwing rocks at your tent. You're packing up and you're going to go. And we just don't. Sometimes we want to, but we don't. But they don't leave either. So it's really interesting. I don't know if Daryl talked to you about the Tag 7 experiment that we had. They seem to move within this area. We bought some nano trackers. Everybody's probably watched, when I was growing up, the show was Wild Kingdom. They'll put a collar on an animal or a tracker on an animal, and you've probably seen the guy who scans. He's got that antenna looking device and he's scanning. We bought some of that equipment, and our guys devised a way to make an attempt to get one of these animals to tag itself. We took these very small trackers that were intended for reptiles and amphibians, turtles, things like that. And we hollowed out cocklebur, which is a spiky, almost sea urchin looking seed of just a terrible thing. If you live in the South, you know what they are. And we hauled it out and we put the tracker in it and we suspended it across game trails and suspected travel routes at a height of 6.5, 7 feet to try to eliminate common animals. We also bathed these things in rat trap glue to make them extra sticky. And we had several of them out, and Tag 7, the 7th one that we had out, was activated upon something picking it up. And the group that was there at the time, it was just starting to get dark when they realized the tag had been activated. It was very close. The signal was very strong, but it was about to get dark and said, okay, we will pick it up in the morning and we'll go after it in the morning. The next morning, they couldn't pick it up. They couldn't find the signal anywhere. And they went miles in every direction trying to reacquire the signal, and they never could. To shorten the story, basically what it took was for us to get a plane in the air equipped with the antenna and the receiver unit. And it was a couple of mountains over in a different valley, different area. We had a ground team on the ground getting directions from the pilot and the member that was up there working the receiver. Anyway, we tracked this thing over a course of several months, got 25 to 27 definite location GPS marks on it. And we would direct the ground teams, and the ground teams got within, we believe, 100 meters or so from it, based on the strength of the signal they were getting from the handheld receiver. But the weakness of this technology is its direct line of sight. So if this thing ducks into a ravine, you'll lose it. If it goes on the other side, it crests the mountain and goes down the other side, you lose the signal. And this was the gnarliest, thickest, nastiest stuff. And this thing just traversed it so quickly, and we just never could get eyes on it. But we did get that data, and we put that data together. It was considered enough to be a viable number of hits. It's on the low side, but it was considered on the low end of what's acceptable. And we worked several different formulas for home range, and it's a bigger home range for everything except a mountain lion. It's comparable to that. But Mark McClurkin, who had come up with with this plan with the cocklebur and everything, he had tested how well these things would adhere to different hides that he had. And short-haired hides like deer, for example, it just didn't seem to stay long. And so we felt like a mountain lion, which are not really supposed to be up there anyway, according to the Oklahoma wildlife folks, was not a good. Plus, it was suspended 7 feet in the air. So when it was taken, anything else, bear, coyote, significantly smaller ranges than this thing showed. Mark also tried to, we thought, what, did an owl pick it up? Did a hawk fly through? This stuff just didn't adhere to feathers. He tried it over and over again. It just would not stick to feathers. And so it became obvious we weren't going to track it down. So we were hoping it would actually dislodge and that the animal would shed the tag. And because it was all the stickiness and everything, it was bound to have hair all over it and DNA evidence. But it never did during the life of the tag. We tracked it for about 8 months, 8 or 9 months. And then the battery expired and we never located it after that. But so it was the same general area. It never left. This area, it did expand away from that location where it was picked up to some degree. We picked up the signal. What helped was it was winter and the leaves had fallen off the hardwoods. And so the plane could the receiver could penetrate the canopy. And it was on higher ground than the valley where it picked it up. Is that a seasonal move that it makes, or was it just roaming and foraging as it went? But that's another reason we don't think it was a bear, because it was prime hibernation season for the black bears and the Washitas. They don't sleep straight through, but they don't roam miles and miles and valley upon valley away from their den area during that time. So whatever it was, had a big old home range, and this was in the dead of winter, was definitely not hibernating. And so we have that data, and that was one of our, we consider that experiment a success. We've tried to duplicate it and not had any luck. So we may have gotten amazingly fortunate there early, but we've not been able to duplicate it yet.
It's definitely fascinating stuff. I know that Bigfoot isn't the only thing you've been interested in your entire life. There's been other things that you have spent time researching and looking into, and you've written a couple of books. So I definitely want to talk about the books. And what about these black cats? You mentioned the big cats earlier and mountain lions. I know you're into black panthers and some of that research. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you found about these cats? Because that's something that, at least in the quote unquote cryptid world, comes up often. I get pictures from people here in North Carolina who have seen black cats, and it's a thing across the continental United States and even in the UK. So can you talk a little bit about your research into that and what you found?
I was a member of originally of the TBRC, like you said, but I have a variety of interests in all of its oddball stuff. So I started a blog to feed this other interest that I have. It's called the Texas Cryptid Hunter blog. And so I would just write about strange experiences people here in my home state of Texas had. And one day I did just a quick story. A black panther, someone in Plano, Texas, had reported seeing a black panther. And I did a quick write-up on it, and my inbox just blew up. It was 10 times more correspondence than I had ever gotten after doing, say, a Bigfoot post or something like that. Now, where I'd grown up, everyone believed in black panthers. They didn't think there was anything that special about them. They weren't something you saw every day, but everybody knew somebody who had seen one or heard one, the screaming in the woods, it's a panther. And it was just considered another animal that lived out in the bottoms, It wasn't, I was embarrassingly old before I found out there was no such thing. And people, well, yes, there is. I've seen them on TV. And what those people have seen is a melanistic leopard or jaguar. Melanism is the opposite of albinism. Instead of a lack of pigment, it's an excess amount of pigment. And so these normally spotted cats are black. But they're still just regular leopards or jaguars. They just have this genetic condition. But there's no species of animal called black panther. And the other thing people don't realize is that according to science, there's never been a documented case of a black mountain lion or cougar. They just don't seem to have the genetics to do that, according to science. But people that'll look at you cross-eyed if you say you saw a Sasquatch, they'll tell you all about their black panther sighting that they had. And when you tell them, you know what, that's just as crazy as the Bigfoot sighting. If you listen to the scientists, they're ready to fight at that point. But so whenever I did a post on these black panther sightings, again, the inbox would just fill up. And so I said, I should do something with these. So I started to plot them on a map and see if there's some kind of pattern I could discern, that kind of thing. And people were seeing them exactly where you would expect to see a large predatory mammal, which is in the eastern part of the state, where all the rivers and the water sources and the cover is. Not completely, not totally, but mostly 85%. And so I vetted as many as I could, and would publish the ones I felt were legit. And so again, I thought, I really should do something about this. And so I started working on this book. I said, I'll do a book about this. And wasn't sure if anybody would want it or anything like that. But anyway, it turned into a book called Shadow Cats, The Black Panthers of North America. That's the name of the book. And that came out in 2017. And as far as I know, it's the only book dedicated solely to the Black Panther phenomenon. There are chapters in your Cryptids of Texas book. They're going to say something about Black Panthers. But as far as I know, and I could be wrong, but as far as I know, it's the only book length look at the phenomenon. We look at possible candidates, what these things could be. We talk about the historical sightings, contemporary sightings, interview big cat experts, some who have seen them themselves. Do a lot of the old historical newspaper stories, things like that. It's a fun book. But again, we look at the possible suspects and, what might be the explanation here. And so that's where that book came from. And that's how I got into that. So I've been away from that a little while, and I'm going to get back to it. I've got a backlog of things I need to get caught up on because I've been so neck deep in the NAWAC stuff. So we'll try to get back to that, get caught up, and reinvigorate that blog and that topic a little more. But that's how that book came about.
I think that would be awesome, man. I would definitely like to check that out. And the other book is The Valley of the Apes. Can you tell a little bit about what went into that book and where people can find the books and the best place to pick them up?
Sure. Valley of the Apes is basically the story of the North American Wood Ape Conservancy. Its beginnings and how we started out is the terminology we use is weekend warrior. Like everybody else, we have a 3-day weekend. We'd go out in the woods and see what we could find, see what we could do. We had some surprising successes early, considering that we were feeling our way along in the early days. It talks about several projects, like there's one called Operation Forest Vigil, which was the camera trapping project I alluded to earlier. It was in the big thicket in Area X, where we're doing everything we could to get photographic evidence, just all the techniques and things we've tried over the years. And it's a book. You want it to be exciting and fun for people to read. So it's a NAWAC greatest hits too. It's like the weirdest, scariest, strangest things that have happened. That's what it tells you about. And it goes into how we found Area X, the things that have happened in Area X, and it goes right up through 2019, 2020, right when COVID set in. It goes all the way up to that point. It's been out now for a little over a year. But so Valley of the Apes and Shadow Cats are both available anywhere online books are sold. So your Amazons, your Barnes and Noble. You can also go to Anomalist Books. That's my publisher. I believe it's just anomalist.com. But if you just did a search for Anomalist Books, it would come up. You contact me if you want a signed copy. Be glad to accommodate anybody with that. But anywhere online books are sold, you can.
I will definitely link to it in the show notes. You guys go check it out. Pick up the books. Michael Mays, I really appreciate you coming on the show, man. I've had a blast talking to you.
Well, it's a pleasure. And I always appreciate somebody who asks serious questions and who's really trying to get to the bottom of it. And so from that standpoint, I thank you as well.
Awesome. I appreciate it.